Good morning, Janine, and welcome everyone. We'll be getting started in just a few minutes.
Thanks, Kerri. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're discussing a hot topic that's top of mind these days. Let's talk about strategic approaches to California's indoor heat illness prevention standard. I'm Janine Vaccaro, and I'll be moderating the event today. First, I'd like to go over a few items before we jump into our presentation. In efforts to minimize background noise, we have muted all attendees. But we do encourage questions and comments throughout the presentation using the chat box located on the right-hand side of your screen. This applies to any technical assistance you might need, as well as submitting questions about the information covered. So send them in. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Kerri Greene. She's a principal consultant at BSI Group. She has 33 years of experience as an EHS consultant and regulator. Kerri's implemented outdoor and indoor heat illness hazard assessments, written prevention programs, developed work plans and procedures, and delivered online and instructor-led training to support employers' heat illness prevention initiatives. So take it away, Kerri. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar today. This webinar is focused on indoor heat illness prevention in California. The regulation's been in effect for about 6 weeks now and approximately 2 heat waves. And employers are still grappling with how to do their training and their assessments that are required by the regulation in California, but just wanted to focus that this is not just a California issue. There are multiple states that have indoor and or outdoor heat illness prevention regulations. And just this summer, a few weeks ago, federal OSHA published their draft indoor and outdoor regulation, and that is open for comment at this time. So heat illness is an issue that impacts nationwide. When the Bureau of Labor Statistics did a 30-year study of heat illness, they found that annualized there were approximately 40 fatalities per year nationwide and 3,400 illnesses nationwide per year. Looking further into that data, they found that the bulk, 80% of fatalities, were related to that outdoor heat. But when you look at the illnesses, the bulk landed in indoor heat. So some of those work environments that folks have been toiling in, bakeries, kitchens, garages, warehouses, that indoor heat can have just as much of an effect on illness, just not tipping over to the same level of fatalities as those outdoor heat illnesses. So the focus of these regulations is really to drive down those illnesses and fatalities. In California's case, the regulation for outdoor has been around about 20 years. And in 2023, there were actually 0 fatalities related to heat illness occupationally. So it's showing that the employer, the employees' efforts are working to drive awareness, get those heat illnesses under control and emergencies handled rapidly so that we don't lose people on the job. The webinar here today, we're not going to go over all the ins and outs, the nuts and bolts of the regulation. There's a lot of information out there, and what we're trying to cover today are some of the specific strategies we've seen clients using to address their indoor heat illness hazards and compliance with this regulation. And we were hoping to share some of those strategies. And then, of course, if you have discussion points or if you have strategies and approaches, this is a great networking opportunity to share some of those, especially if you have unusual operations or situations or problems that you have solved. So overall, this new indoor heat standard, of course, does not apply to outdoor. That's completely different. But when you're defining indoor, some of that is causing confusion for folks. There have been repeated questions on forums and webinars in Cal OSHA communications about what is indoor. And they are very transparent that it took a long time for the courts to help them decide what is indoor. So it's basically any workspace where employees are present, where there's a ceiling and then covering, and then any type of enclosed perimeter. Even if parts of that perimeter, like bay doors, are open or closed, it's still considered indoor. And then we'll talk a little bit more later about vehicles because they get a little bit tricky. So you'll see a lot of the requirements for responding to heat illness if you are triggering that 82-degree temperature. 82 is the one number you need to be aware of, and then obviously 87 also if you're looking at that second level of heat trigger. So 82, the lower being if workers are around radiant heat, or if they are wearing equipment or clothing that would restrict their ability to shed heat. There is an ability to assume that your work environments exceed those temperature thresholds, and that allows you to just skip directly to controls and not do those temperature measurements, but we'll talk a little bit about that later. Because one of the concerns then is if you do skip straight to controls, which is fine because you're trying to bring down those temperatures and make that work environment safer, but how do you monitor it? Do you have a strategy to continue to monitor and check to make sure that it is holding them down to that safe level, that compliant level? So when we talk about the indoor heat illness standard, similar to outdoor, it has a written plan requirement. They want written procedures on how the employer will implement it. And Cal OSHA did publish a combined template plan. But what we're finding with the end users, the employees and supervisors, and employers trying to create their workflows is having the two together gets convoluted. You're suddenly talking about 4 different temperature ranges. You have different levels of requirements that can get convoluted. In addition, when you put the two together, the end user may not necessarily work in outdoor, but they're trying to figure out indoor or vice versa. So keeping those two plans separate is a recommendation to allow them to stand alone. There are some overlapping requirements, but it really helps separate and help the end user implement it. In addition, you could add these to your IIPP. Cal OSHA has made that offering. It is just not recommended to do so. And one of the reasons for that is if you do have a complaint, an inspection, an investigation, that keeping it separate from your IIPP allows that investigation or inspection to be targeted to what's the hazard, what's the complaint. If you have all of your programs and procedures in one document and you hand them over your entire book of procedures for maybe what's an outdoor heat complaint, and suddenly you've got your indoor heat plan being investigated, keeping them separate really keeps those things nicely siloed and targeted to the hazard of concern. Cal OSHA does have a really nice graphic comparing the two standards and showing what overlaps and what does not. All right, so the next strategy, how do you go about it? You've got maybe your obvious operations, kitchens, laundry areas, warehouses, manufacturing with hot processes, but those definitely pop up. But do you have other locations and operations that may not necessarily pop to mind right away? So here's where having that building and operation inventory can be a good strategy. and help you think outside the box, talking with employees. The regulation does encourage active employee engagement in the evaluation. But are there other places that maybe you are not aware of? You haven't done that job, or you don't have information about it, and that's where that direct employee engagement can help. Um, a lot of employers are confused. Hey, if I have a building with HVAC, I don't have to worry about this, correct? And that may be the case, but there are areas in buildings that do not have HVAC service. They don't have air conditioning in them. So, do you have employees working in those environments? Those could be things like stairwells, uh, equipment rooms, sometimes outer storage areas that will have a bay open, and maybe employees can grab materials, put them in their trucks and use them in their operations, things like that. That could be an indoor space that you're not keeping account of when you're thinking, my building's air conditioning, I should be fine. Um, the other thing that can happen with air conditioning is if you have areas or entire systems that are not working properly. So if they did fail, especially during a heat wave, it always seems like that's when it's going to fail. Maybe you're waiting for parts for repair. Could those temperatures get higher than the trigger points, and being prepared for that? So really recommending employers look at what's the maintenance history on your HVAC system. Are there areas that do have history of complaints? How will you monitor that information? um, Communicating to employees, hey, let us know if a work area starts to get warm so we can start to address it. And then have some backup plans on how are we going to control it. If, for example, we do have a failure, do you have those business continuity plans in place to bring those temperatures down, or move that staff into a cooler area to work until you can get that HVAC working? The next strategy that seems to have employers scratching their head and getting a bit confused is conducting those assessments. And it really boils down to that common word, reasonable. If you can reasonably anticipate that your HVAC will go out on the hottest day, if you can reasonably anticipate that outdoor temperatures may cause your interior space to raise in temperature, you can reasonably anticipate that you're going to hit those triggers of 82 or 87. There are ways to, there are ways to address that through temperature assessment. And the regulation is pretty uh, particular about how you do that, with a thermometer for temperature, a hygrometer for relative humidity, and then if you are monitoring temperatures from radiant heat, using a globe thermometer. Uh, However, doing that is not necessarily going to get you to that compliance, because you're also monitoring for heat index. So you can get combined equipment that will give you the temperature, the relative humidity, and a reading calculation of heat index, or you can go to that beautiful rainbow chart from the National Weather Service and calculate that yourself. So here we have an example of a garage that has bay doors all around it, and we do see they've got their thermometer posted next to their clock. But if you're looking at the monitoring and assessment requirements of the regulation, that is not enough, because it's not giving you relative humidity, which would allow you to assess that heat index. The next strategy, the questions that come up around vehicles, especially if you have different types of operations and vehicles in use. We thought we'd address that here because they are considered indoor spaces if they have that covering and enclosed around all that perimeter. However, if you have a loader, a forklift, as the example here, that is open with no coverings, and maybe you're using it indoors, it's indoor. If you are using it outdoors, now it's outdoor. And that can be really confusing based on the location and the configuration of the vehicle. The other key issue is, does it have a functioning and effective? There's another one of those keywords to look out for, an effective air conditioning system. So outdoor heat illness standard allows vehicles to act as kind of an arc for cool down and shade as long as employees are in it while the air conditioning is running. And indoor heat, it pops up because as an exception to the standard does allow you to have that 15-minute incidental exposure, but that exception doesn't apply if the exposure is in a vehicle that doesn't have air conditioning. And obviously, we've all hopped into a vehicle in the middle of summer, and we know how hot that can be, especially if it's been sitting for a while, especially if it's been in direct sun. So that is the example of why that incidental exposure exception is not allowed, because employees that may be working at that higher intensity, at that higher temperature, once they pop into that hot enclosed box of a vehicle, could really tip them over into heat illness. So there's our example of a forklift, open and enclosed, but this could also apply to side-by-sides and utility vehicles and any of that heavy equipment that is being used on a work site. The next and last strategy we wanted to talk about was, you've done your assessments or you've assumed that you do exceed those trigger levels. Now what? We know we have to comply with all of the requirements in the regulation if we are above those trigger levels. But then if you've done an assessment and you have to implement the control section of the regulation, what does that look like? How do you organize that based on the variety of operations or the variety of buildings or even areas within the same building that you may have? And one strategy that we use often with clients is a playbook. This has become something that we used first with ergonomics back in the day, and still use to this day, where you have that qualified ergonomic equipment list that people can choose from. Then we used it more recently with COVID-19 prevention options. We use the playbook strategy for workplace violence prevention. And it's basically a way to prioritize and list the controls that are available to address a given hazard, and then even hone them down and implement and reference specific pieces of equipment that have been approved and reviewed by your safety team, your purchasing team, your operations team, referencing specific procedures within your organization, so that it really helps bring that control understanding and options for implementation right to the employees and supervisors who are working together to evaluate and address any of these hazards from indoor heat. So it's a really effective tool, something that you can put in, incorporate with your building inventory and priorities, and also help you address ways to maybe get credit for the things that you're already doing, that your employees are already doing, that are already being implemented, and see what else needs to be or may be implemented. So one example of that is, we are probably all familiar with how we control the temperature in our homes. You get up in the morning and you close the windows before you leave for work so that outdoor temperatures don't affect your indoor space. Sun goes down, it cools down, we open windows, so we're getting breezes and it's shady now and we're starting to cool the indoor space. So typically doing that in workplaces as well, opening the bay doors in the morning to let in cool breezes, but as the sun changes and as outside temperatures raise, we close the bay doors. So that a playbook is a good way to document some of those procedures that maybe people don't understand why we do them, but it really educates the team on why and adds that as a level of control for those hazards. Some of the administrative pieces that are listed as options for some operations may not work for your operation. You may not have the ability to shut down manufacturing once temperatures get high enough, but having a list available that has been qualified and reviewed by your teams and your stakeholders of other solutions that can be used that would be effective, that allows for a more nimble response to temperatures when they raise and a more effective and safer work environment in controlling those higher temperature hazards. So the last piece, and kind of the last resort, because it's relying on personal protective equipment and user uh, the end user actually using it properly, is that PPE. And do you have certain pieces of equipment that are available on the market, but maybe not effective in your operation or even compatible with your operation? So having that ability to assess, set up, purchase, have them in your storeroom, make sure that this equipment is compatible with the chemistries, with the operations, with the movements that staff are using. Um, Doing that ahead of time, so when you do have to implement that, you've got it all set and ready to go. Engaging employees with that equipment, what's effective, what's comfortable, having them try different pieces of equipment really gets that employee engagement piece that is increasingly emphasized in the regulatory view, but also helps them have more buy-in and use the equipment properly because they're practicing and helping to choose it. So that's our last strategy. Just a list of offerings, some of the things that we've been doing with clients, and just helping to document the work with clients. So whether that's their written plans, helping conduct those inventories and risk assessments for different operations, and getting all of that written down to show your efforts as an employer that you did do these assessments. You are reasonably anticipating what the hazards are and reasonably evaluating what the controls are. That shows that due diligence when there is an inspection and compliance oversight. Um, have you chosen temperature monitors? Have you chosen that equipment? How do you calibrate it? How do you keep it maintained? We have industrial hygienists that can do third-party assessment and calibration, and give you that qualification of the work and assessments that you've been doing. Of course, we've got that playbook or just the playbook concept if it's helpful to you, so that you can go ahead and have your plans, your controls laid out so everyone's aware and knows when to implement them. And of course, with this type of training, it's really great talking directly to employees, either through an online custom training specific to your organization, or give them some general information so that when it gets down to that shift start of meeting, that job specific safety training, tailgates, job aids, that everybody has an overall concept, but maybe now you can just talk about what's happening today, what's happening with this certain environment or operation. So those are some examples of different approaches to compliance with this regulation. And then we are nearing our end, so I did want to invite Janine to come back on and invite you if you have any discussion that you wanted to include with this network or any questions.
Thanks, Kerri. That was great information. Fantastic. I learned a lot. We have a couple of questions. So, one is, can you give clarification on the mechanics bay roll-up door, please?
Yes, that has been a very Common questions. So I think a lot of a mechanic's bay in a garage is considered an indoor space. So it does get to that barriers around all sides, whether they are open or closed. So even when you do have those big openings that it feels like you're practically outdoors, it is still considered an indoor space.
Great. And here's a follow-up on the no annual training required. Does this mean that all new hires should be trained? And if nothing changes, is there no refresher training required?
Yeah, that is an interesting piece of this regulation. It requires employee and supervisor training, but it does not give a frequency. So, following that IIPP frequency of before an employee is exposed to an indoor heat illness hazard is really important. And then, of course, if anything changes, so changes might be a change in operation, materials, equipment changes, excuse me, may be in the environment. Changes may be in your procedures that you would need to train employees to make sure they're very aware of what the current practices and hazards are.
Okay, I have a couple more. So if anybody would like to pop another one in to the chat, go ahead. In the meantime, we'll cover the last couple. Kerri, would an employer need an indoor, heat plan if the only anticipated way employees might be exposed to heat above 82 degrees is if the AC breaks, for example, in an office environment?
Yes, and that is a tricky one. So, if it is not reasonably anticipated to exceed the trigger level, then it is not considered part of the regulation, covered by the regulation. And that's where it becomes important to kind of review what's our maintenance history here. Do we have a history of complaints? Do we have a history of a lot of work orders and service orders to fix our HVAC system? Um, when you are in some of those higher temperature from weather, from heat waves, a lot of super sunny days, or um, you're seeing that maybe temperatures are starting to feel warm, it may not be a bad idea to check and confirm that your temperatures are staying below the trigger, because it could, with a malfunctioning HVAC system, pop you into that need for compliance with the regulation. And if you haven't done that assessment and plan now, and suddenly you're in the middle of a heat wave and your HVAC is out, that's probably not the time you want to start making your plans to cool the area or to train and communicate with your staff. So thinking about that ahead and kind of monitoring what's the history can help you decide what your risk is there.
Okay, great. Um, I'll leave it at that and ask that anybody on the call, if you have additional questions, to send them to us. Our emails are here. You'll have this information. Um, and so I guess with that, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. Please do look out for our follow-up email within the next few days, which will include a link to this recording and also information about some of the upcoming webinars on other great topics. We've got them showing there. We'll send more information on that. And again, if you do have additional questions, please don't hesitate to contact Kerri or me using our emails there. And we thank you again for attending and hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Janine. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.